Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie ganz herzlich zur letzten Mosse-Lecture begrüßen und freue mich, dass Sie trotz des kleinen Hindernislaufs, den die Universität Ihnen zumutet, hergefunden haben. Uns ist der 250. Geburtstag des Namensträgers unserer Universität in die Quere gekommen. Wahrscheinlich wird sich noch die eine oder der andere im Laufe des Abends hier einfinden. Wir haben diese Vortragsreihe hier gemeinsam mit unseren Gästen des Semesters dazu genutzt, um der Frage nachzugehen, welche Freiheiten, welche Befreiungen und welche Emanzipationen es genau waren, die im Zeichen des Liberalismus versprochen worden sind. Und die Vorträge haben klargemacht, dass diese Freiheiten nicht umsonst zu haben waren und bedingungslos gewährt werden, ohne Ansehen der Person, ohne Ansehen ihrer Möglichkeiten der Teilhabe an Gütern wie der Bildung, die eben nicht per se Gemeingüter sind, ohne Ansehen ihrer kulturellen Herkunft und religiösen Überzeugungen. So gern der Liberalismus nach wie vor als normative Grundlage berufen wird, um Partizipationsrechte für eine größere Allgemeinheit zu reklamieren und die Entscheidungs- und Selbstbestimmungsspielräume der Einzelnen zu vergrößern, so wenig ist zu übersehen, dass der Appell mehr Eigenverantwortung für die meisten inzwischen nicht in erster Linie eine Glücksverheißung bedeutet, sondern die Zumutung beinhaltet, immerzu auf Probe zu stehen, sich unermüdlich bewähren zu müssen und ausgesetzt zu sein in einen täglichen Überlebenskampf, in dem die Chancen genauso ungleich verteilt sind wie die Risiken. Der freie Markt ist kein idyllischer Ort, auf dem sich Tauschgeschäfte dann am besten und zum Wohle aller abwickeln lassen, wenn die Politik sich heraushält und mit dem Schieben von Nachtwachen begnügt, sondern er erzeugt ein Missverhältnis von Gewinnern und Verlierern, das politische Fliehkräfte freisetzt, die Konversion von Kapital in Macht begünstigt und Regierende unter Zugzwang setzt, ihr Handeln nach den Prinzipien der Marktkonformität auszurichten, und zwar im weltweiten Maßstab. Es war Angela Merkel selbst, die ein solches Agieren als alternativlos, Sie werden sich erinnern, bezeichnete. Inzwischen hat der Begriff des Liberalismus mit der Vorsilbe Neo versehen einen schlechten Klang bekommen. Man verknüpft mit seiner Nennung vor allem die Nötigungen, die mit den egoistischen Profitinteressen international operierender Investoren und Konzerne verbunden sind, weit eher als die Lizenzen, die durch die formale Garantie von Freiheitsrechten zwar juristisch zugesichert werden, ohne dass die Möglichkeit ihrer praktischen Einlösung dadurch mit präjudiziert wäre. Die Folgen dieser Auslegung der Handlungsfreiheit als Handelsfreiheit sind die, dass der Erdball in das Gravitationsfeld von Macht- und Marktkonzentrationen geraten ist und unter einer Hegemonie des Westens steht, für den die übrige Welt nur als Rest in den Blick gerät. Pankaj Mishra, unser Gast des heutigen Abends, den wir herzlich begrüßen, formuliert seine Kritik des Liberalismus deshalb als Globalisierungskritik, aber auch als Verteidigung und als verständnisvollen, wenn nicht zwangsläufig sympathetischen Nachvollzug einer Kritik, die den Diskurs verlässt und sich im aktiven Nihilismus entlädt, die Energien von Affekt und Erregung mobilisiert und den Konsens gewaltsam aufkündigt, die westliche Moderne habe den Globus mit der besten aller möglichen Welten beglückt. Pankaj Mishra ist studierter Wirtschaftswissenschaftler, aber auch Anglist. Er ist in den vergangenen 20 Jahren auf vielfältige Weise als Schriftsteller und Publizist hervorgetreten, der die Effekte der Globalisierung im Hinblick auf die Verflechtungsprozesse von Osten und Westen, auch auf die wechselseitigen Wahrnehmungen und Projektionen kritisch untersucht. Sein Reisebericht Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, der in 1995 einer internationalen Öffentlichkeit bekannt machte, verfolgt die kulturellen und sozialen Veränderungen in seiner Heimat Indien, die von England nicht mehr kolonial beherrscht, aber von der westlichen Welt umso stärker ökonomisch dominiert wird. Erwähnen möchte ich außerdem das Buch India in Mind von 2005, das in einer Anthologie fiktive und nicht fiktive Indien-Imaginationen und Eindrücke von Mark Twain über Allen Ginsberg, Bruce Chatwin, Hermann Hesse bis hin zu Peter Matthiessen versammelt. 2006 hat Pankaj Mishra unter dem Titel Temptations of the West, in der deutschen Übersetzung heißt dieses Buch Lockruf des Westens, 4 Essays publiziert, in denen er unter anderem die historische Entwicklung Indiens rekapituliert und über die Gefahren nachdenkt, die für Indiens Demokratie mit dem Erstarken des Hindu-Nationalismus verbunden sind. Pankaj Mishra ist Fellow der Royal Society of Literature und ein gefragter Beiträger weltweit wahrgenommener Zeitungen und Zeitschriften, darunter der Guardian, der New Yorker und die New York Times. Für sein Buch Ruins of Empire, das den Wiederaufstieg Asiens und die Revolte gegen den Westen in einem historisch und geografisch weit gespannten Raum nachzeichnet und das vor 4 Jahren in deutscher Übersetzung erschienen ist, ist er im selben Jahr in Indien mit dem Crossword Book Award und 2014 mit dem Leipziger Literaturpreis zur europäischen Verständigung ausgezeichnet worden. In diesem Jahr hat Pankaj Mishra ein neues Buch veröffentlicht, das den Titel Age of Anger, A History of the Present trägt und dessen deutsche Übersetzung der Fischer Verlag gerade heute ausgeliefert hat. Sie haben also draußen auf unserem Büchertisch, einige von Ihnen werden es schon gesehen haben, druckfrische Exemplare liegen und Herr Mishra ist gerne bereit, im Anschluss an die Mosse-Lecture und an die Diskussion, so Sie das wünschen, einzelne Exemplare zu signieren. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass er heute hier ist und zum Abschluss unserer Vorträge noch einmal eine Frage aufruft, die uns während aller Vorträge begleitet hat. Von welchem Liberalismus ist eigentlich die Rede, wenn wir Liberalismus sagen? What Liberalism? Wobei sein Blickpunkt auf dem gespannten Verhältnis zwischen Anglo-Amerika und dem Rest liegt, das das unscheinbare Wörtchen und Anglo-America and the rest zur friedlichen Koexistenz verharmlost. Pankaj Mishra, we are extremely glad to have you here tonight. We welcome you at the Humboldt University and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Ethel, for that very kind introduction. I'm really privileged and honored to deliver a talk in this series. And of course, people always start their talks with statements of this kind, but in this case, I'm being perfectly sincere, because when Professor Sherpa invited me, I told him that I was working on a book, or had just written a book, that owed a great deal to the insights of George Mosse. And because he highlighted this very precarious nature of modern civilization from a very intimate experience of fascism, mass murder, writing out of personal circumstances of refugee, a Jew and a homosexual, made him concerned with these questions of racial stereotypes, exclusionary practices, and of course, masculinity. And of course, he wrote of primarily a European experience of the pathologies that are always latent in the process of modernization, of socio-economic development. But a measure of his insightfulness today is that his work is being verified, as I stand here, in the country that he never wrote about, which is India. We are witnessing there today the rapid nationalization of the masses, the emergence of new myths, new symbols, the invention of politics as drama, as aesthetic spectacle. The cult of Hitler is rampant across India. Mein Kampf is a perennial bestseller in India. The scapegoating of minorities, the kind of rhetoric used against liberals, cosmopolitans, rootless cosmopolitan is a word you hear over and over again. And of course, the construction of an ethnic racial identity by demonizing, identifying the other, the internal enemy, who needs to be purged. So in many ways, this work of Mosse's has been crucial in steering me away from traditional history of ideas approach to looking closely at mentalities, how they are formed, states of minds, and in modernizing society, especially late-coming modernizing societies of the kind Germany was in the late 19th century. Oh, sorry. Should I manipulate one of these? Is that better? Is that better now? It is. Sorry about that. His great book, The Crisis of German Ideology, in many ways you can see there is a kind of old opposition there, which is a Cold War opposition between irrationalism and rationalism. His later works, especially those on sexuality, masculinity, outline forms of exclusion that actually emerge from what is described as a rational sphere, from within bourgeois ideals of strength and beauty and respectability. The whole imperative that modern societies imposes to be strong and manly. So these dominant ideals of bourgeois society as it begins to develop, as it begins to emerge, which continuously describes people who do not adhere to its norms as abnormal or irrational. The large pattern I think he began to see in his later books, a large historical pattern, which, essentially a kind of broad framework of the modern, where the bourgeois is triumphant with his morality, with his aesthetics, and with practices of exclusion that are built into this, including the temptation to describe the other as dangerous and immoral. And he did this, as I said, without really talking about the non-European world, or indeed much about Britain and the United States, or indeed talking about the issue of imperialism, in which the practices of judgment and exclusion and othering were imposed on the majority of the world's population. So what I want to talk about today is this philosophy of the Anglo-American bourgeoisie, which is the main philosophy, which is liberalism, and its own practices of exclusion, especially when allied with imperialism, and its invocation of universal norms that turn out to be deeply self-serving, not to mention inapplicable for large parts of the world. I mean, it's obvious in many ways that we stand here at an extraordinary moment when many of these ideals of liberalism are being questioned right within Britain and the United States. The two countries that pioneered democracy, global capitalism, or claims to have pioneered them, and with this supporting philosophy of liberalism, offering the world a universal model of development and growth, are suffering one political earthquake after another. Which is just a tiny example of the ideological U-turns that are happening, where the leaders of Britain and the United States are turning into neo-protectionists, rejecting those free trade zones, those open markets that they themselves had built. I give you these quotes from a recent document. We do not believe in untrammeled free markets. We reject the cult of selfish individualism. We abhor social division, injustice, unfairness, and inequality. These words come from the manifesto of Britain's Conservative Party, whose leader, you'll remember, many of you, once said that there is no such thing as society. The Financial Times, which is, as you know, the preferred newspaper of Anglo-American elites, had an article last week saying that Anglo-American elites are facing a nemesis which comes from believing your own marketing. I'll quote from this. It said, "The US and Britain stand out among Western democracies as unmarked by revolution or occupation during the 20th century. The longer a country is stable, the more complacent it becomes. Anglo-American elites have played fast and loose with public trust. Their comeuppance has been long in the making." But what is it that they were thinking? What were these fantasies that have now been shattered and broken? Well, at home, the promise was that the rising tide of globalization will lift all boats. That was the promise made again and again. And that private wealth will eventually trickle down. The ideals of this kind of liberalism were more ambitious abroad, which is that Western ideas are only Anglo-American ideas and institutions. Liberalism, democracy will be gradually spread around the world. Aspiring middle classes created by rapid market-driven economic growth will bring about accountable governments, stable governments, and that basically every society is destined to evolve just as Britain and the United States evidently did. The long history of imperialism, genocide, slavery, all the comparative advantages created for the United States and Britain by these events and processes did not feature in this narrative of progress. Or if they did, they were seen as aberrations from a generally benign model of progress. And this narrative has underpinned most newspaper editorials, politicians' speeches. In the Anglo-American world, it has informed popular culture and even much academic work. It has framed larger views of political developments, economic developments in the non-Western world. Countries have come to be measured by how much progress they are making towards this Anglo-American model. And of course, these fantasies have been around for a while. The American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once spoke of the bland fanatics of Western civilization who regard the highly contingent achievements of our culture as the final form and norm of human existence. So these bland fanatics have been around for a long time. But I think the collapse of communist regimes in 1989, that is what especially emboldens many of these fanatics. This old Marxist teleology of revolution was retrofitted in this whole end of history thesis. And there were many crude theories about the inevitable march, universal march to prosperity and stability. Liberalism was reincarnated as neoliberalism, and its ideals invoked to justify the radical structuring, with, of course, the help of powerful institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, of entire societies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. There was a new institutional framework proposed within which latecomers to the modern world could achieve the virtues of individual liberty. So export-oriented free market strategies based on privatization, state companies, deregulation of financial markets, currency adjustments, foreign direct investments, subsidies, cuts in subsidies, lowering protectionist tariff barriers, introduction of flexible labor laws. This was all institutional, the institutional re-engineering that was being offered by the so-called Washington Consensus formulated in the 1990s. Of course, all through this period, 90s onwards, there were protests in different parts of the world against this harsh regime. As it turns out, the politically most consequential victims of the Washington Consensus were in Washington, D.C.'s own hinterland. And today, of course, Trump's victory has focused many minds on these manifold problems of rising inequality and unsustainable debt and shrinking middle class right in the heart of the modern West. And the political landscape elsewhere, from China to Iraq to Thailand features a variety of political forms, social movements, political mobilizations, which are further away from this Anglo-American model than at any time. So the spell of universal progress through Anglo-American liberalism has been decisively broken. And I think if we are shocked and appalled and confused by these political earthquakes of our times, it is because we have been living, whether in the East or the West or the North and South, with all kinds of vanities and fantastical illusions. We forgot about all the tensions and contradictions in this modern project of universal emancipation, which was originally formulated in the late 18th century, that George Mosse, among others, did so much to highlight. In many ways, this is the moment, and many writers of the Frankfurt School, even older writers, are being rediscovered, are being made accessible for a general audience in Anglo-America today. Older writers like Edmund Burke, or even Carl Schmitt has become very relevant for his critique of liberal democracy and of liberalism as a kind of bourgeois ideology which hides the workings of power. But what I think the historical experience of many Asian countries tells us, quite apart from this philosophical critique of liberalism, is something much more interesting, I feel, especially about the present moment. And I'll seek your patience in advance, because I'll digress a bit and take a few shortcuts through some complex bits of intellectual and political history. But I do want to return to the present with this particular trajectory of liberalism in the non-West, and by non-West I mean here mostly India and China and Japan. There was an Irish writer and critic who wrote very well about Burke, called Conor Cruise O'Brien, in the 60s, who traveled a lot in Asia and Africa. And he wrote that many people in these countries are sickened by the word liberalism. As he put it, they see it as an ingratiating moral mask which a toughly acquisitive society wears before the world it robs. O'Brien himself was very dismayed because he thought of himself as a liberal, at this point at least in his career. And he couldn't understand why liberalism had come to be seen, as he wrote, an ideology of the rich, the elevation into universal values of the codes which favored the emergence and flavor the continuance of capitalist society. He thought that this idea of liberalism as sickening was just too harsh a verdict on a set of ideas and dispositions that seem to promote democratic government, constitutionalism, rule of law, minimal state, property rights, self-regulating markets, and of course, the empowerment of the rational, autonomous individual. What he didn't really see, that although liberal ideas in the West, in Europe, emerged from a variety of contexts, for many contexts for power, improvisations, in a variety of political economic settings with roots in Christianity, but they were eventually shaped to fit the mold of the market freedoms, right to private property and free labor, freedom from state regulation and taxation, that capitalism needed if it was to thrive. These ideals could not and did not seem particularly liberal to the peoples subjugated by British, French, and American imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were, contradictions and problems in the rhetoric of liberalism right from the beginning. Samuel Johnson famously asked, how is it about the secession-minded American colonists? How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes. John Stuart Mill tried to resolve a similar moral discrepancy that confronted India's British overlords by crediting them with benign liberal intentions towards a people that he saw as incapable of self-rule. As he wrote, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians if the end be their improvement. Tocqueville, of course, felt no need for this ingratiating moral mask. For him, the French colonial project in Africa, in Algeria, was a glorious enterprise, a vital part of French nation building after decades of political turmoil. And it wasn't just this deeply entangled history of liberalism and imperialism that in the 60s made many Asians and Africans suspect liberalism. As O'Brien himself wrote, during the Cold War, many European and American liberals upheld the most illiberal forms of anti-communism. Similarly, modernization theorists from America who were promoting free enterprise and equal rights as a formula for prosperity themselves came from countries with long histories of economic protectionism and institutionalized racism. But the important fact here is that post-colonial nations had their own alternatives to Anglo-American liberalism. Even in those countries such as India and South Korea that did not install communist or socialist party structures, they had in place systems of government based on a mixture of central planning and intervention in markets. Non-liberal policies and institutions appealed to many state builders in Asia because, as Raymond Aron, he was visiting these countries at that time and worrying about the appeal of communism in Asia in the 1950s, he confessed that liberal methods in politics and economics in these countries were doomed to fail. Now, today, of course, notions of representative government property rights are embodied, institutionalized diversely in many Asian countries and African countries. And recent anarchic forms of capitalism have brought forth this ruthless individual who pursues his own self-interest at the expense of everyone else. But it would be very difficult to argue that the notion of the autonomous individual, minimal government, and the invisible hand have found much purchase in the political cultures of India, China, or Japan, the three countries I will mostly talk about here. And there are very good reasons why the idea, most vigorously articulated in the United States, that hardworking and self-reliant individuals make for a great nation, so long as they enjoy free markets and limitless resources, received a very different spin in countries that came late to the modern world. Let me stress again that the presence or absence of liberalism, their particular meanings, cannot be detached from the specific history, culture, socio-economic conditions, and particular needs of each society. So, of course, ideas of individualism, liberalism, anywhere in Asia did not grow, as they did in Europe, out of the Reformation stress on individual responsibility, the rise of capitalism, and the related needs for market freedoms. For many late developing societies, like India, China, and Japan, the question of liberalism was inseparable from a very deliberate and urgent pursuit of modernization, which only a strong state seemed capable of advancing. The power of Western imperialism, which had compromised their sovereignty and exposed them to racial humiliation, had confronted them with a bewildering range of urgent tasks. So foremost among them was building up a sense of national identity along with a centralized state that was capable of protecting citizens from internal and external security challenges. The state was also expected to provide the right impetus for political, economic, and social transformation of the society. So in late developing societies like India, China, and Japan, where the state, rather than the self-motivated individuals, were expected to generate political and economic and social transformation. With this experience of Western imperialism, these societies felt obliged to replicate every process and institution that appeared to have made some Western countries so powerful and wealthy, whether it's secularization, nationalism, sense of national identity, a centralized bureaucracy, an army capable of protecting society, a division of labor between political, social, economic realms, and also, in some cases, popular participation in politics. But catching up with the West, nevertheless, remained or seemed impossible without a strong state. The paradox is that liberalism seemed attractive largely because it promised to advance the urgent project of state-led modernization. So colonialism, this idea that liberalism could produce self-aware, free individuals who would participate in the tasks of state modernization. So these ideas of individualism were around, and they provoked a quest to redefine the self, its relation to the community, to the state. And this reception of liberal ideals can be seen in all three countries, but most clearly in India, where the intellectual, in their intellectual realm, where an oppressively colonial state, which posed as an agent of modernization, forced many to define a self in contradistinction to it. The Indians who began to embrace some of these ideas of liberalism basically created India's modern art, literature, and philosophy. But any kind of individualism that did not stress the role of community and society in the formation of the moral self was generally not acceptable. Christopher Bailey, the historian, wrote in his book, Recovering Liberties, Indian Thought in the Age of Liberalism and Empire, that the valuation of the liberal individual in India was impregnated with the idea of sharing generosity and compassion, dramatized by tropes from the Indian classics, the Vedanta, and particularly the Bhagavad Gita. For many Indian thinkers, as they saw it, liberalism was a system of duties and obligations. Ethical conduct, not rational self-interest, came first. Gandhi proposed this idea of moral freedom and individual rights that had very little to do with, for instance, with John Stuart Mill's conception of progress. He said that true civilization is that mode of conduct by which man does his duty. Performance of duty is the observance of morality. To observe morality is to discipline our mind and our senses. Many other members, he was not alone, of an upper caste Hindu elite, consistently upheld a superior ideal of personal and national culture against these utilitarian obsessions of British imperialism, and also the commercialism of a rising Indian bourgeois class. So there could not be any easy transition from this highly moral notion to possessive individualism of the European kind. And in any case, as Christopher Bailey pointed out, that any such transition would be constrained by the weight of Hindu-Muslim tradition, Indian familial caste relations, the self-abnegating interpretation of Hindu devotionalism, and the colonial context more broadly. So even very sympathetic readers of John Stuart Mill were pushed by the unavoidable facts of deindustrialization and widespread impoverishment into economic nationalism by the end of the 19th century. Because horrific famines were caused by a fanatical British allegiance to free trade. And this great suffering, which the colonial government in India did little or sometimes nothing at all to alleviate, made impossible an Indian argument against government interventions in the market. In fact, free trade, which in Asia was accompanied by brute force, never had much of a chance in Asia, where the most influential Western economist was Friedrich List, not Adam Smith. List had rejected, as many of you know, Smith's free trade theory as unsuitable for the 19th century conditions of rivalry and inequality between nation states. He had also spotted that liberal economies favored the trading interests of Britain, which had industrialized before everyone else. So economic nationalism seemed imperative to Asian countries that were entering very late in the game the race to industrial modernity. So the Indian mutation of liberalism was from the very beginning more communitarian, more concerned with the fate of society rather than the individual, and more hospitable to the idea of state intervention in the economy. The same is true of the reception of liberalism in China, where foreign invasions and civil wars rendered even less likely liberalism taking hold in national institutions. Some of the earliest modern Chinese thinkers, such as Liang Qichao and Yan Fu, grappled with abstract European notions of the rights-bearing individual, but they were doing it against a background of China's semi-colonization by Western powers, encroachments on its territories by a rapidly modernizing Japan, the crumbling of the old imperial system and its notion of universal kingship, and, of course, the urgencies of nation building and state building. So there were, as with Gandhi, as with some other Indian thinkers, attempts to redefine the self in terms of duties and responsibilities and to propose new models of social and political community. Of course, liberal economics was deemed incompatible with the Chinese communitarian tradition. And the meaning of these liberal concepts that were adapted by Chinese intellectuals, often through Japan, were shaped by the cultural assumptions embedded in the language. The Japanese invention Jiu, which in turn derived from Chinese characters, had become the standard translation of liberty. But this invention could not be cleansed of the implication of selfishness carried by the original term from which it had been drawn. Similarly, laissez-faire becomes fangren in Chinese, which also connotes rejection of responsibility for one's behavior. The Chinese thinker Yan Fu, who translated the works of Adam Smith and Mill, had serious trouble with such terms as rights, legitimate self-interest, will, reason, judgment, individual spontaneity. But he did believe that Western powers had mastered the art of channeling individual energy into national strength, and was convinced that only a free society and democratic institutions could guarantee a similar outcome for China. But even he could not break with the Confucian ideal of a non-competitive world in which self-interest is subordinated to social harmony. So his liberalism did not conceive of individual rights as an end in themselves. Rather, they were the means to national power and wealth. Liang Qichao also learned about liberalism and democracy from Japanese interpreters of English liberalism. Now, these liberals tended to see liberty in terms of its contribution to the Japanese project of national self-strengthening, rather than in terms of natural rights. So they enshrined the importance of a strong state in this era of foreign imperialism, and Liang followed them in stressing the importance of cultivating patriotic individual citizens for participation in public life. So, as you saw it, individual rights, individual liberties were meaningless in a country that was not independent. The important thing was for citizens of the new China coming to being to be of service to the state and enable it to withstand the great power of Western economic imperialism that was growing larger all the time. And he obviously spoke out of an experience visiting America, visiting Europe, and he started to fear that these American industrial trusts would soon cross the Pacific. He thought they were more powerful than Alexander the Great, than Genghis Khan. They would soon cross the Pacific Ocean to prey upon a weak China. So to hold its own in this international jungle, China did not need socialism or free market so much, but industrial production through capitalist methods carefully regulated by the state. Of course, Japan, from where most Asian thinkers are deriving their ideas from, has already embarked in the 19th century on an ambitious project of state-led modernization, first to resist and then to catch up with the West. And the elites of that country very self-consciously embarked on this program of modernization through which they hope to abandon backward Asia and join civilized Europe. So there were liberals during the civil rights movements of the 1870s who were espousing a kind of negative freedom, upholding individual rights against state power. But they also hoped that the powerful nation state would advance individual autonomy. And later in the early 20th century, people who were reading List wanted the state to devise and implement social welfare policies for the benefit of the working poor. They saw the inequalities built into modern capitalism and hoped that the state would build the capacity to manage these inequalities, to reduce them. And they also wanted Japan to enter the international system of competitive imperialism. That drew many liberals into supporting Japanese militarism and imperialism. There's a very interesting figure here, Yoshino Sakuzo. Yoshino, a thinker, first developed an idea of the organic state in 1905 at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. Every individual, as he saw it, had to be mobilized for the war effort. At this point, he believed that Japan must insinuate itself into the Western liberal club. The liberal ideals and institutions of Western Europe had helped facilitate a self-regulating global market with multilateral imperial exchanges. So Japan had to fight Russia because it was violating international rules by trying to create a closed market in Manchuria. So that was his thinking. But he spent 3 years in China, and he went to Europe, and Yoshino became more aware of the true sources of Western power. He saw that Japan lacked the advantages free trading European countries had accumulated by industrializing and colonizing early. So Japan needed protected markets of its own. So he identified China, where all the advanced major Western powers already had their stakes, as a suitable laboratory for the Japanese experiment in liberal imperialism. And he became a supporter of these humiliating 21 demands for extraterritorial rights and commercial privileges that Japan presented to China in 1915. Japan, of course, as it was growing as an international power, it was required of it that it should concede more ground to the states in domestic affairs. And Yoshino's proposal was a political system in which securing the welfare of the people was the purpose of the government, and in return, the population at large participates in the imperial project. As he put it, it's absolutely necessary to solidify the nation's inner strength through popular awakening. Now, this scheme, which avoided all notions of popular sovereignty, was directed against oligarchs and bureaucrats who he saw were indifferent to the population's general welfare. So he was building up a whole series of rationalizations to fortify this liberal project of progress at home and expansion abroad. So he helped popularize this notion that China, which had neither a centralized government nor a developed industrial economy, was not yet a proper nation state and needed to be helped up the evolutionary ladder by Japan. This was the rhetoric we heard in India and other countries all the time. Now, he wasn't advocating a retrograde militarism. He, in fact, deplored Japanese excesses in China and argued for a more peaceful expansion. Rather, he constantly defined Japan's goals in China with reference to liberal philosophies of progress and development. And of course, these kinds of naive loyalties to the rhetoric of liberalism was to prove disastrous for Japan, first economically and then politically. Japan had joined a global financial system run by Britain before the First World War in order to secure Western capital for its program of national expansion. But the rules the Japanese began to realize of this international order were not set up for the benefit of have-not powers. So this whole hegemony of orthodox American, Anglo-American ideas of economics helped to keep Japan in recession in the 1920s. Japan began to liberate itself from the system only when it went off the gold standard in 1931 and embraced economic nationalism, restating a fully managed currency and comprehensive state controls over trade and industry. And of course, the consequences of this new course, radical course, was increasing alienation from Western powers, withdrawal from the League of Nations, and finally, war with the United States and Britain. What I've tried to show in this very short, very compressed account is the contingent nature in Asia, and of course, now we see in the West, of liberalism and its impossibility in adverse socio-economic conditions. It also reveals the constraints on the political choices open to the great majority of the world's population in a rapidly changing and menacing political environment, geopolitical environment. And they also, this account I hope shows that these old normative explanations of the rise of liberal capitalist modernity tend to suppress one of its major enabling factors, which was imperialism. Because in the case of Japan, we can see very clearly that its own liberal project was shaped by its acquisition of an empire and its faithful absorption of the transnational norms of imperialism, along with the rhetoric of progress and development. Its intellectual and political leaders consistently echoed the 19th century European rhetoric of liberalism, according to which civilized Europeans brought progress to uncivilized societies, using violence and force whenever necessary. Yoshino, for instance, was providing a kind of Japanese variation on this progressivism when he justified the termination of Chinese sovereignty. But his real counterpart is not John Stuart Mill, who was, after all, the theorizer of a rich, established empire, but his fellow, the fellow Anglophile Tocqueville, for whom Britain was both a rival and model, a country that has raced ahead of its European peers in the quest for glory and power. So Tocqueville developed a great enthusiasm for the colonization of North Africa after arriving at the same conclusion as Yoshino did about China, that the development of a stable and liberal democracy at home might require the exploitation of societies abroad, and that the principles of equality for conquered people would have had to be suspended. So unlike English liberals, who sustained a self-serving myth of benevolent empire, Tocqueville allowed himself no illusion about the need for violence. As he wrote, "I've often heard men in France whom I respect but with whom I do not agree, find it wrong that we burn harvests, that we empty silos, and finally that we seize unarmed men, women, and children. These, in my view, are unfortunate necessities, but ones to which any people who want to wage war on the Arabs are obliged to submit." Now, these kinds of practices were precisely what Japanese liberals, as well as militarists, felt obliged to submit to during Japan's savage assault on China in the 1930s. The problem, of course, for the late-coming imperialists was that the global race for surplus value and resources, which had underpinned liberalism at home in the West, had already produced its ultimate winners. Liberalism failed in Japan, because the country did not already have the power and wealth of the imperial nation state working in its favor. And it was always extremely fragile because, as Raymond Aron put it in The Opium of the Intellectuals, nowhere in the West during the long years when industrial populations were growing rapidly, factory chimneys looming up over the suburbs, and railways and bridges being constructed, were personal liberties, universal suffrage, and the parliamentary system combined. The modern state in the West itself was constructed during the decades when there were autocratic regimes in which universal suffrage was combined with the absolute power of a single man. There were parliamentary regimes in which the suffrage was restricted and the assembly aristocratic, or there were constitutional monarchies. Now, these secrets of Western power, many post-war Asians learned better than pre-war Japanese liberals. Individualism, laissez-faire economics, and a fundamental distrust of state power were discarded everywhere in Asia in the rush to build and consolidate a strong national buffer against the liberal empires of the West. Confronted with the imperatives of modernization, almost all Asian nation-states chose protectionist economies and political institutions that put national unity and order before individual rights. So successful economic modernizers such as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and Malaysia's Mahathir Mohamad even went so far as to claim in the 1990s that Asian values of social cohesion, thrift, had achieved prosperity more speedily and safely than liberal individualism. Even in India, the state had and still continues to have huge amount of prescriptive powers over what is now a more marketized economy. More importantly, we see there a mass politics which is based upon caste, religious solidarities, in which particular groups, rather than individuals, are the bearer of rights, consistently undermining this kind of politics, the liberal vision of secular, self-motivated individuals. And what has happened in recent decades, more interesting and disturbing, in that India embraced many Anglo-American notions of economic rationality, of free markets, and started to abandon its old social welfarist projects in which the state had played a large role. India's ruling elites, increasingly American educated, imported a kind of technocratic wisdom in which the state should step back from public life and markets or individuals competing in the market would create prosperity for all. So these cliches about rising tide of globalization will lift all boats, private wealth will trickle down, these became commonplace in recent decades. But what we have seen, and it's very clear now, is the creation of a social jungle marked by exploitation, inequality, and a state that, weakened by various crises, increasingly appears to lack authority and legitimacy. In many ways, today's Hindu nationalist movement is an attempt to rebuild the state's legitimacy through a program of national unity and cultural nationalism. It is constantly offering new values, ideals, historical myths, symbols, and rapid nationalization, repoliticization. So this new experiment in free market capitalism connected to Hindu chauvinism, supremacism, promoted, embodied by the state, and of course, a large, important part of it is the demonization of Muslims and Christians. So not for the first time, an experiment in economic liberalism has created an opening for fascistic and semi-fascistic movements. Japan, of course, became an American protectorate after the war and enlisted into a liberal capitalist order centered in the United States. But Japan's turn to economic nationalism in the early 1930s was never fully reversed. The country largely generates its own capital and remains incredibly, to the amount to which it remains barred to foreign investment. In fact, by some measures, its economic system today is more closed and centrally organized than it was in the 1910s and 20s. But it is China today that poses the biggest challenge to Anglo-American ideologues of liberalism. Because when confronted with the urgencies of survival and self-strengthening, Chinese communists systematically overhaul the body politic in order to command loyalty from the people, ruthlessly crushing all individual challenges to the arbitrary power of the centralized state. The heirs of Mao Zedong, who allowed China's citizens more room for economic initiative, did not break with the imperatives Liang Qichao had identified, which is to mobilize China's resources to make it truly secure and to postpone the expansion of individual freedoms. So today, despite extensive marketization, the state perches on the commanding heights of a globalized economy, encouraging state-owned enterprises and maintaining control of strategic industries. Development is the only hard truth, Deng Xiaoping once claimed. If we do not develop, then we will be bullied. Speaking of the Chinese dream, the Chinese leader today, Xi Jinping, asserts the same imperatives of national unity, strength, and pride against the need for broad democratic reform. The many micro-freedoms to consume, to travel, that have been made available to the middle classes help stave off challenges to the authority of the state. The Chinese regime invokes Mao one moment, Confucius the next, for the sake of ideological legitimacy, and they seem no less self-serving than the people who spoke about Asian values, but they are not wholly unpersuasive when they present liberalism as an unaffordable plaything of rich people. The elevation, as Cruz O'Brien wrote, into universal values of codes that for so long favored a tiny minority and are now unlikely to survive the anger and disaffection of everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk, also for the trajectory that you made. And yeah, sorry, I for myself feel the need to get back to some of the arguments you made to be able to follow you in every step. And maybe let me start with the quotation of O'Brien that you mentioned, where you said he was very astonished to see. Is it better now? What? Then I have to eat it. You said that O'Brien has been very astonished to hear, as a traveler in Japan, that liberalism has been considered as an ideology of the rich. And then, if I understood you correctly, in the second part of your talk, you said, well, there has been a kind of deliberate import of liberal ideas by, and that's my question, by whom exactly? By Japanese intellectuals or by rich people, or how do you explain this? I didn't get the connection between those two.
I should have clarified that. Thank you. These are the first generation of thinkers, modern thinkers, people exposed to ideas from Europe, and people who are obsessed with question of survival in this geopolitical jungle in the late 19th century, and are desperately sort of looking at Western ideas and institutions, thinking that perhaps they can appropriate them selectively in this task of national self-strengthening. So these are some of these people selectively interpret and adopt some of these notions. Okay, individual autonomy is great, but individual autonomy and self-aware individuals should then participate in the task of nation building, state building. So it's a very selective appropriation of the sort of idea of the autonomous, rational, educated individual. So they are doing this, but by the time Conor Cruise O'Brien is visiting Asia and Africa in the 1960s, there's a whole different historical experience that has happened, where the connection between liberalism and imperialism has become too vivid to many generations by that time. So it's very difficult for them to not only embrace this particular ideal, but to have anything positive to say about it. That is, that is in a way their attitude is the culmination of several bitter experiences of that kind of rhetoric, that kind of talk, and you think, behind it, it's really it's what you see is a kind of workings of power, of a very aggressive kind of power behind the benign rhetoric.
Getting back to this, you said that the original aim, the original aim to adopt these Western ideas has been to strengthen the nation. On the other hand, you accuse liberalism for having weakened the nation, or having weakened things that then made it possible that, for instance, I jumped to India, that Hindu nationalism could arise and then, in a certain sense, promote this idea of nation again that had been neglected by those who adopted liberal ideas.
This is, with new liberalism, we see a kind of liberalism on steroids. We see, forms of hyper individualism. There's a very deliberate undermining of the state, of the state's authority, its role in redistribution, in taxation, in regulation. Right from the 1980s, that is what accompanies it. And when that kind of rhetoric emerges in a largely poor country like India, it has, in many ways, a much more a sort of toxic effect. What it basically shows is that the collective project or social welfare, all of these things are simply, ideological fantasies that we should discard. It's entrepreneurial individuals who will make the country great again, or who will make the society great again. So in this context, this is where when the state steps back from its traditional roles and responsibilities, someone stepping in saying that we will restore the authority of the state, the legitimacy of the ruling class, presents himself as a protector of the weak, of the poor, with a whole lot of very compelling rhetoric about identity, all constructed along ethnic, racial, religious lines, identifying various internal and external enemies. It's in this context of accelerated neoliberalism that Hindu nationalism has sort of emerged.
Okay. And where does anger, the topic of your new book, come into this analysis? Because what you presented to us was a very sharp analysis about why certain ideas could be attractive in a certain period of time, but then fail to really match the problems that arose. This is not an analysis of anger. How does anger come in as a sort of, as you mentioned in your book, as a sort of particular form of criticism that doesn't need arguments, but in a certain sense mobilizes affects?
I think it's the argument of the book is that in many ways the disaffection that was unleashed during the process of industrialization, urbanization in the 19th century, which first provoked the emergence of demagogues, ethnic racial movements, scapegoating of minorities, all the sort of pathologies of modernization. Those have gone truly global, because essentially global economic, the state of our interconnectedness and the speed with which ideas, ideologies, not to mention capital and various other globalizing forces move, that this junction between the promise of stability, of security, of equality and prosperity, these that modern ideals have provided, that promise is constantly belied by, you know, the local ruling classes in countries like India, of course in the Middle East, where states cease to be, you know, viable, and in fact so much energy is going into simply holding on to their existing territories. So when we see anger in its global manifestation today, what we see today is a sort of certain European pathologies which we first saw in Europe, now globalized. And there's a special, in a way, sort of, there's a sort of special force here behind this particular anger, which is that the states or the projects of the past, with which certainly in post-colonial Asia we began in 1945 or in the late 1940s, they were all conceived as large state-building collective projects. You know, somewhat not very dissimilar from post-45 Europe, the construction of social democracy here after the war, and the idea that the state should, you know, intervene in certain areas. These were the ideas that so much of post-colonial Asia and Africa, in a way, emerged after 45. And those have been steadily discarded, as I just pointed out. So for many individuals in places like India, there are simply no safety nets of any kind. There are no buffers. There are no intermediate institutions. So this practice of individualism that they're called upon to undertake, which has always happened in some sort of a constraining context, you know, whether it's the nation, whether there are, you know, mutual associations, trade unions, you know, all of these institutions that exist between the state and the individual, those have been systematically undermined. So people feel a state of powerlessness, of humiliation, that I don't think that even in the 19th century you felt exposed in quite the same way as many people do now. So this is where, you know, anger connects with this particular argument.
But then who is the addressee of this anger? I mean, what you describe as Hindu nationalism is an extreme hostility towards Muslims. And this doesn't fit exactly to the diagnosis you gave us. So how do you connect those two things?
Not just against Muslims, Christians, minorities generally, also against liberals, various rootless cosmopolitans, whoever can be defined as someone who's not really a true Hindu. The definition is very flexible. It can be extended against, you know, all kinds of individuals. So the project of constructing a community or reconstructing a national community through the practice of exclusion, that is what the Hindu nationalists are engaged in right now. That this older community has not brought us what we were promised after 45, which is national wealth and power. It is through this construction of a truly Hindu community that we will achieve this glory and power. And in this process, one has to purge the community of the people who are holding us back.
And would you consider this to be a necessary consequence of liberalism? Because one can read your book in some passages that if we would say, well, liberalism in itself and with the ideas it promotes needs to, has to lead to such.
Well, I think there is a kind of, a sort of presupposition that individuals are essentially these essentially people who need the supervision of, or at least the control of a state authority, and that the needs essentially they are competitive. There's a sort of in whatever sense liberalism is a philosophy, there are these kind of anthropological suppositions built there, and what often happens is that this vision that individuals will conduct a war of all against all, if we don't have the market, if we don't have the law, when the market starts to malfunction and the law begins to seem like something that is simply disguising power, then we actually see this condition, the civil war condition that is built into this anthropological presupposition. So I'm not saying that liberalism always creates these conditions, but there is something in the way the world it brings into being is one where these conflicts become more inevitable, where it breaks from any ideas of the common good. That is not supposed to be something we should be even discussing. That's something for individuals to consider privately. So a whole realm of human activity is banished to the private realm. And that then creates the conditions for someone like Narendra Modi to come and say, I'm going to come and redefine the national good, the common good.
I'm looking into the audience. And please feel free to ask a question.
Thank you very much for the rich and dense lecture, but sometimes hard to be understood because of the acoustic system.
Sorry about that.
Same
at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that the human rights, the individual autonomy, things like this were part of liberalism. And this disappeared from your screen totally. And you focused on the economical side of liberalism. So could you close this gap by saying what happened to these individual human rights, particularly as in these three countries that you mentioned, they are all treated different. So I'm very suspicious that you have a one theory for 2.5 billion people in 3 different states.
I don't
say how the human rights are treated differently.
Well, I don't think political liberalism or the idea of individual rights can be separated from economic liberalism. The two come together. Why do we make this artificial separation in the first place? That these ideas are essentially formulated to advance a project of expansion, which is one of capital. These ideas are not something that are emerging in a vacuum. They are emerging in the context of an expanding Europe. So how can we make that separation in the first place? So individual rights, therefore, are deeply connected to ideas about the marketplace and how those individual rights will play out in the marketplace. This construction of the abstract individual with rights is very much intimately related to the market. So unless one wants to moralize about this, that's another thing altogether. But human rights, all of these notions, and human rights, that is a separate discourse altogether. The discourse of human rights is a discourse of post-45 Europe. This is not something that can be easily linked to the previous discussion of human rights. That post-45 discussion of human rights is very much part of the whole kind of Christian formulation of the individual, where after having seen those individual rights being trampled, a new idea of human dignity is being offered, is being formulated. Now, in what way is that connected to these forms of liberalism that I'm talking about?
One more question there. So you think human rights are not universal?
I don't know what that question actually means. What are we talking about when we're talking about human rights? What are these abstract human rights?
Freedom, for example.
Of course it's a universal right. But, why is that question important? This is what I want to find out. Why is that question asked? You see what I mean? That why do you feel the need to ask that question? Without understanding, without actually exploring this particular history. So I will, of course, say that, yes, I'm all for freedom. But who is asking the question, in what context, in what circumstances, is that also not important? So it becomes a rhetorical, moralizing question. You see what I mean?
I see what you mean, but I don't want to make it a dialogue, but I totally disagree.
Yeah.
Totally.
Thank you.
There has been another question, but I can see the hand anymore. Yeah, up there.
Hello. Yeah. So in thinking about what liberalism we're talking about, I was wondering if your thinkers in China and in India made distinctions between French-style liberal colonialism and ideas of mise en valeur and socialisatrice, which weren't really ideas that the British were very keen on using in their non-state-based promotion of economic development, and the Americans who use proxies and local elites to control, for the most part. Right? So the difference between settler colonialism and non-settler colonialism, I'd like to see how they saw it and what aspects they do.
Yeah, for many of these people who are working with imperfect translations done mostly in Japan, these kinds of distinctions are not really possible for them. To look at how these things are working out in different contexts. It's only later when the evidence, documentary evidence, starts to arrive. Say for someone like Liang Chichao, a great friend of his was a Vietnamese nationalist who brought reports of how French colonialism worked, but then there was not much there for them to actually start doing a comparative account of just how these different systems work and what their particular ideologies was. What was more important to them was the experience of oppression and racial humiliation. That was how they were talking about this. It was not this whole sort of, we forget, especially in universities, that these are not ideas in a vacuum. These are ideas that are emerging out of a lived experience of humiliation. So the idea of self-strengthening, these are all attempts to build protection and barriers against humiliation. So if somebody comes along talking about rights or talking about that, they are immediately alert to that particular notion. What is this rhetoric hiding? What does it actually mean? What is that person meaning? So this is, I think we should not forget this particular context in which these ideas are being received, reinterpreted, selectively formulated, and it's all really part of an existential battle.
About this post-1945 was about human rights.
No, can you speak up, please? It's really difficult, and we imagine how difficult it is for you to hear us. Yeah, now it's better, okay. I think, yeah.
Thank you for that talk. About this post-1945 discourse about human rights, what connection do you see there for a liberalist, a liberal ideology?
Which liberal ideology?
That's a very good question. Maybe there's one you see more specific role for than for another one. But.
Well, the problem really is with this discourse of human rights, and one reason why I said we should always examine the context, that this has been invoked over and again for extremely violent and destructive wars. We've seen that in our own lifetime. Many of the people, the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, destroying millions of lives, all fought for this noble cause of human rights. So, not surprisingly, many people are suspicious of this language of universalism, which advances specific interests and continuously claims a high humanitarian and benign ideal. So this is where I think this whole language becomes problematic, and we should be rightly suspicious of it. So, of course, yes, in the abstract, we are all for human rights. Of course we are. But in what context are these working? In what context, who's using the language at what time? That is something we have to be alert to. There can be a broad agreement upon, so many of these issues, so many of these values that the word human rights is supposed to encompass. But then after that, there has to be an examination of how those values are actually advanced in the world we inhabit.
So thank you. Kind of building on to the question asked by Sophia and our previous audience asking. So let's go into the context that I was very interested in. So in the liberal imperialism in Japan during expansion in the 20th century, I was wondering if other ideologies, like maybe cultural, maybe more contextual ideologies, played a major role in that. For instance, Asianism, which was one of the major ideologies in Japan. Because recently, my friends and I wrote a book about politics of food in global cities. One city that we chose was Tokyo, that had a very good connection with Indian nationalists at the time. Raj Bahari, I think he was an exile. He escaped. He was running away from British imperialism, and he brought the secret recipe of curry to Japan. But because of the idea of Asianism, so he stayed. I think I was wondering if that's something in addition to liberalism that you talked about, or that's something more in the cultural context. And also another question is goes to the concept of China, because you mentioned how earlier things that I Chao would embrace this idea of liberalism, but in relation to the more traditional thinking, so maybe a more collective sense of human nature. But I was wondering if there's a connection to the later, maybe dark side of collectivism, that huge emphasis on collectivism during the revolution eras and the actual understanding of liberalism in relation to more traditional ways of understanding the collective sense of self. So, yeah.
Sure. Pan-Asianism, again, was an ideological construction by the Japanese ruling class. It started off by, through many well-intentioned Japanese individuals who were meeting people elsewhere. Rash Bihari Bose, quite a lot of people from Java, from Burma, who also participated in it. But all of them ended up deeply, bitterly disillusioned with that project, because in the end, Pan-Asianism turned out to be yet another noble ideal disguising the will to power. In this case, the Japanese state's expansionist project came to be disguised by this rhetoric of, how we are going to essentially improve the lives of all these people across Asia, give them liberty from the European oppressors. That became, in rhetoric at least, this sort of great project of the Japanese state. But the reality, of course, was different. It was brutal. So for many people like Bose, and there were many other Indians who were deeply attracted to it, it was a very cruel experience of finding out that what they believed in so fervently was something that was actually meant for completely different purposes. It was meant for, as with the experience of liberalism for many people in Asia, that is connected with a particular nation state and its expansionist and imperialist project. So again, that's what I was trying to say in the lecture, that Japan replicated many of these this sort of bait and switch tactics, that you offer. You say something, you do something else, and often with the same kind of language: progress, development. China is backward. We'll give them a helping hand. We'll go in there and set up. What happened was sheer savagery. The other. Do you mind repeating that? Sorry.
Yeah, the other one is about. I kind of sense you were, in a way, in a more positive sense, praising Liang Qichao's way of embracing liberalism with a more, in relation to its own cultural heritage and thinking as a way of understanding without the kind of particular.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what he embraced, the kind of collective understanding of human self also has a dark side, which was proven to be true during the revolutionary years in the last time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really important. I wrote at length about him in my previous book. It's important to see these intellectuals. That's why I keep insisting in sort of actual, real, living context. Here is someone who is exiled, who's living in Japan, who has to flee China, otherwise he would be executed. And he turns against the Chinese imperial state at that time with a ferocity, with an intellectual ferocity. At that point, he's a liberal individualist. He thinks that, like Lu Xun, the way Lu Xun denounces Chinese traditions of collectivism, and how much he wants the Chinese to really destroy this whole political system that has enslaved them and become true individuals. These are kind of extreme liberals at that time in their thinking about rights. And then, while Liang is in Japan, he starts to experience a different kind of political reality. He comes into contact with people from other parts of Asia. So his frameworks, his analysis of himself, his position in the world begins to expand. Then he travels to America, which is a big awakening for him, where he sees many of these ideologies and philosophies that he'd embraced in action. And he's appalled and shocked by the conditions of African Americans and various other minorities, by the conditions of Chinese in America, how really appallingly they are treated, how rife is the racism against them. Then he travels to Europe during the First World War, and he realizes this whole idea of competition, nation states outdoing each other has caused this slaughter that nobody knows how to end. So, what I'm saying, that people undergoing these different historical, personal experiences, and they're constantly improvising, coming up with new ideas. And mind you, their country is not independent at this point for much of this time. It's still, either run by the Manchus or, the sovereignty compromised by Japan and other and Western powers. So these are people moving from one set of ideas to another, wondering what would work best for them. And I think, even in his later phase, he starts to go back to sort of these Confucian ideas that he had so violently rejected early on. So you see these sort of long intellectual, ideological journeys. And then, of course, there are the pressures of history. So if you look at Mao in the 1930s and 40s, the kinds of things he's saying, but then he comes to power and he becomes this arbitrary, brutal despot. Because of these pressures that you have to emerge from the Civil War, you have to simultaneously fight a war in Korea, you have to build a strong state, and also the temptation of private power, the temptation of personal power. All these things start to work upon this figure, and of course, then we see this development of a kind of autocracy led by Mao Zedong. So what I'm really arguing for is to take ideas and sort of put them back in their concrete settings, and also in the lives of individuals, how they responded to a particular event, how did they see a particular kind of rhetoric, at what stage in their lives.
I'd like to pick up your question from a different angle, because what you mentioned is that all the countries that you discussed did have alternatives before taking up the experiment of liberalism. And I'm wondering if you say that one of the effects of this experiment has been that the specter of political alternatives has grown smaller and smaller. Is that what you're saying? Or would you say, no, there are still alternatives, for instance, to fascist movements in India? What about them?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, when political choices, when sovereignty is abrogated, when your political choices shrink, the freedom to have the kind of economy that is suitable for your particular country, for its geographical position, for its resources, when ideals, ideologies that have emerged in some other part of the world in a completely different historical context, when they are taken elsewhere, what they do is shrink your space of maneuver, of political maneuver. And of course, one must never forget the overall geopolitical condition, which all through the 19th century for all these countries that I'm talking about is one of imperialism, that they have to confront, they have to survive this confrontation with imperialism. So all their choices are made in the shadow, and the choices are few and far between, and people keep lurching from one to another depending on the changing historical conditions. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that liberalism in tandem with imperialism, connecting the world together with its ideologies of free trade, with the practice of free trade, bringing all these economies together into one network, radically reduced the political options available to man. Not surprising, so many of them end up being authoritarian or fascistic. That is what I'm arguing for.
Okay, but one can still ask the question if the nation state is the universal remedy to all this, right? Well, in a certain sense, the idea of nation is as artificial and, if you might say, as ideological as the idea of imperialism. There is no difference in...
Well, the thing is, here is, going back to Liang and Kang Yu-wei, his contemporary, although elder to him, that these people are not comfortable with the idea of the nation state. Many of these people, like even Mao, is not comfortable, Nehru is not comfortable. There is a strong tradition in political Islam that is directly opposed to the nation state as an idea. So there is, a long tradition of critiquing the nation state, thinking that this European thing does not work for us. Our societies are heterogeneous. They're just very different. And what is the point of shoehorning them all into this particular model? But the problem, as one after another historical crisis erupts, they realize that European powers, with the nation state, with the industrial economy, have mustered up a kind of power that can only be confronted, and you can only survive it by essentially creating the same sources of power in your own society. So the nation state willy-nilly becomes the preferred political model, in which, whether your society is homogeneous or heterogeneous, you just have to create this national community, a sense of identity. So in many cases, what we see today with the failed states or failing states or states falling apart, most vividly countries like Syria, is essentially, Syria is also a different case that was actually created by imperialists, but there are many other states where so much of the country's heterogeneity, so much of its different uneven economic variations, they were all forced into this one model, thereby making them unviable, making a lot of the neighbors whose territories were taking away unviable. But this was the existential imperative before them, that if you don't do this, if you don't organize, if you don't mobilize, then you will be swallowed up. This is the language that you hear again and again in all these countries, that if you don't do this, you will be bullied, you will be swallowed up, you will be humiliated. So the nation state becomes this answer, which turns out to be a deeply unsatisfactory answer.
Maybe I can finish with a last question, a very private one. You decided to move to London. I read that you're commuting between London and India. So may I ask you, if it's not too indiscreet, what drove you to the capital of capital?
My wife and daughter, actually, who live there. And,
okay, that's compelling. Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you for listening to us. And
Thank you.